Okay, Erev Tov, we're going to get started. This year, for our Shabbat Hagadol topic, we're going to speak about, can I eat matzo balls and Shnietzel on Erev Pesach this year? Planning a menu for Pesach and Shabbat before Pesach is complicated on a regular year, even more so this year. Because on a typical Erev Pesach, when it falls out during the week, what do you typically eat before the Seder? Give me some examples. You can unmute and just call out, in your home, what do you eat on Erev Pesach on a normal year?
Rice.
Rice. Okay.
Peas.
Peas. So we have
lima
a Sephardi.
beans in it. And the pomegranates mixed together.
Okay. Thank you, Esther.
Mm-hmm.
You eat kitniot on Pesach as well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But only fresh.
Uh-huh.
Not dry.
Not okay. What else? What are other things that people eat on Erev Pesach? In my home growing up, we had boiled potatoes and cottage cheese. Just what we did every year. Simple, bland. It kept us hungry. And also macaroons. We in our family had a minhag of getting sick of macaroons even before Pesach started by having them on Erev Pesach.
We also mixed kemach matzot, matzah meals with olive oil, salt, and eat it with scallions.
Okay.
Make like a hot dog.
Okay. So we're going to come back to that particular example this Erev Pesach. But my point in this little exercise is that typically we're meant we're meant to be hungry on Erev Pesach leading up to the Seder, and so we snack on nothing all day. But this year it's a little bit more challenging to snack on nothing all day because Erev Pesach is Chal b'Shabbat. It falls out on Shabbat, which means that we have an obligation for Seudot Shabbat. We have 3 festive, dignified, meals that we are meant to have as a function of kavod and oneg Shabbat. And so this year we have a little bit of tension in terms of the cuisine on Erev Pesach. So can we serve matzo balls with our chicken soup next Friday night? Can we have fried schnitzel or baked schnitzel on Shabbat morning for an early lunch? And there could be a difference between fried and baked schnitzel, as we'll see at the very end of the shiur. But for now, let's begin with the Rambam's codification of the halacha of not eating matzah on Erev Pesach. I shared in the chat the link to the source sheet. I'll share it again for those that just joined. And I'm also going to share screen so that we're able to view it on our desktops. Okay. Okay. I hope you can see the source sheet. So we'll begin reading from source Aleph, the Rambam and Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah. He describes this halacha as follows: Asru Chachamim. So we see already that it's a din derabanan. Le'echol matzah be'erev haPesach kedei she'yeh heker la'achilata be'erev. So the Rambam says that it is forbidden, it is prohibited to eat matzah on Erev Pesach And the reason is so that there is a heker, something which is recognizable or distinct to the eating that takes place at the Seder. Umi she'achal matzah be'erev ha'pesach makin oto makat mardut ad shetetzei nafsho. And this is a pretty serious prohibition. Even though it's only rabbinic, it's punishable by lashes. So the Rambam here is describing the prohibition here as a function of heker, as a function of making it distinct at night so that it's recognizable. If you eat matzah during the day on Erev Pesach, you take away the intrinsic uniqueness of the mitzvah of matzah because you were just doing the same thing a few minutes ago. What are some other examples of things that we don't do or do on an Erev Chag so as to distinguish between a mitzvah that we do for real and the sort of practice? Who can give me some examples?
We stop blowing shofar on Erev Rosh Hashanah.
Great. Thank you. So why do we do that? So we learned the reason in grade school so as to confuse the Satan, but the more sort of legal explanation is so as to distinguish between the mitzvot or the tkiyot of minhag, the customary blasts that we sound during the month of Elul, and the mitzvot and the tkiyot de mitzvot, the obligatory blasts that we sound on Rosh Hashanah. If we're blowing all the way up until Rosh Hashanah, then what's the difference between the shofar on one day and the shofar on a different day? They seem to be the same thing. So we create a break and we desist from blowing the shofar and from eating matzah so as to make it clearly recognizable that this act at the Seder is for the purpose of the mitzvah of matzah. Okay. Another example is actually on Erev Yom Kippur. There is a mitzvah to eat more than one usually would, and not just for the sake of saving up for the fast, but so as to ensure that one is not fasting on Erev Yom Kippur, because then the same thing would happen in which there would be confusion at what point is one actually fulfilling the fast. So we continuously eat so as to distinguish that the not eating on Yom Kippur is a fulfillment of the mitzvah not to eat. Okay, so the Rambam so far has described the prohibition of eating matzah on Erev Pesach and has given a reason for it so as to keep the first matzah that we eat at the Seder recognizable, distinct, and unique. Now, when exactly does this Isur begin? So, in my family, growing up, we had the custom to stop eating any matzah after Purim, a full month before Pesach. That was the custom that my parents adopted from the Bostoner Rebbe, and so we didn't have any matzah for 30 days. There are some who have custom to desist or stop eating matzah from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so 2 weeks before. But the Rambam here says Erev Pesach. So what does Erev Pesach mean? There are several different possibilities. It could mean all of Erev Pesach, starting from the night before, the full day that precedes Pesach. It could mean from the morning of Erev Pesach, from Amud HaShachar, from dawn, or it could mean from Chatzot, right? Usually when we say Erev Shabbat, we're referring to something that happens the afternoon before Shabbat, not the entire day, at least from a sort of legalistic standpoint. So does anyone else here, out of curiosity, have a similar minhag that I shared about not eating matzah for a full month? You can raise your hand physically or use that function. Just curious. Okay, I see several others who have the similar minhag to not consume matzah for a period of time, whether it is for a full month or for 2 weeks. I'm glad I'm not alone there. So that is the first halacha codified in the Rambam here, and the Rambam continues to talk about a second halacha. You can follow along as I read here, and if you want to follow along in the English, you can also open up as I put in the link in the chat. You can read that as we're going through it at your own pace. So v'chein asur la'achol erev haPesach mikodem hamincha kim'at. So the Rambam says here that it's also forbidden to eat anything at all from the time before mincha until the seder, kedeshi kanes la'achilat matzah b'ta'ava, so that one starts so that one enters into the seder desiring matzah, longing for it, feeling an excitement for it. Aval ochel hu ma'at perot or yerakot, but you don't have to starve yourself. You just can eat some fruit or some vegetables, things that leave you a little bit hungry. Velo yimalei kraso mehen. But even when you do snack on those on that produce, don't stuff yourself. V'chachamim harishonim, the early sages, hayu mar'ivin atzman, they would starve themselves. Era Pesach kidei la'achol matzah b'ta'ava. They would eat so little so that they would have an incredible appetite built up for eating matzah. V'yu matzot chavivot alav. Aval bishar avei Shabbatot o arvei yamim tovim ocha v'holech ad shetachashech. And Pesach is different than a regular Shabbat or another Yom Tov, where you can eat all the way up until maybe you shouldn't have a big meal. But on Erev Pesach, the Chachamim Harishonim would almost have a tzom. They would do a little bit of a fast, not like the fast of the firstborns, even though historically there could be some linkage between these two halachot of fasting the whole day before Pesach, to have real chavivut for the mitzvah of achilat matzah. So in the second half of this Rambam, we see a second halacha that is both distinct yet overlapping with the first. The first one is about specifically not eating matzah, to distinguish with the moment of eating matzah as a mitzvah at the Seder. And the second halacha is being hungry going into the Seder so that you eat the matzah with an appetite, right? But theoretically, if you just had the first halacha, you could stuff yourself all day and not be hungry at all going into the Seder. So the second halacha comes to teach us that you need to develop an appetite going into the Seder. And the two rationales, the ta'amei ha-mitzvot that are given for these halachot are also different. Whereas in the first halacha, the Rambam focuses on the notion of heker, of something being distinct and recognizable. The second halacha is a function of chavivut. Chavivut is less of a formal, distinction or recognizability, if that's a word, of the mitzvah of matzah, and it's more about the psychological state of mind, a certain excitement that one has for the mitzvah of taking your first bite of matzah at the Seder. There's sort of an abstinence in order to enhance the experience later on. So the three questions that I want to pose on the Rambam, which will serve as our roadmap for the rest of our time together, are as follows. The first question is, where does the Rambam get these two halachot from? The halacha of not eating matzah isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bavli. And so it's very curious about the Rambam's source for this halacha of not eating matzah on Erev Pesach. The second question is that of timing. as I alluded to, when exactly is this isur of eating matzah chal? When does it begin? And the third question is, what is the scope of this isur? Meaning, what exactly is forbidden to eat on Erev Pesach as a function of the prohibition to eat matzah? Is anything with a matzah product, anything with matzah meal, going to be prohibited under the umbrella of this isur to eat matzah on Erev Pesach? Or is it more dependent on the kind of matzah that one would use to fulfill their obligation on the Seder night itself? So we're going to be focusing mostly on the first halacha of the Rambam in terms of this isur of eating matzah on Erev Pesach, as we look for a source, as we discuss the timing, and as we think about the scope of this vis-a-vis our menu this year on Erev Pesach. So we're going to go on a little bit of a hunt here for the Rambam's source. Before I do, I want to just unshare the screen to see if there are any questions, any comments. I really would love for this to be interactive and as participatory as possible. Any questions or comments thus far? Okay. So let's go back to the source sheet and try and find the origin of the Rambam's source, or what is the origin of the Rambam's halacha here for desisting from eating matzah on Erev Pesach. So the first option which comes to mind is one that we might be familiar with from learning Mishnayot, the first Mishnah in the 10th parak of Masechet Pesachim, which is really the world's oldest Haggadah. It walks us through all of the steps of the Haggadah and delineates the Arba She'elot and the Arba Banim. And at the very beginning, it gives some staging instructions for preparing for the Seder. And the Mishnah reads as follows. This is source Bet. Arvei Pesachim samuch lemincha lo yochal adam ad shetachashech. So on the eaves, and this is really fascinating in that this seems to be in the plural, Arvei Pesachim. Why would it be in the plural and not in the singular? So some scholars argue that perhaps this is already referencing a time when there were two seders because they were had sfekot safek yom, and so there were two nights of seders. That's why it's in the plural. So Arvei Pesachim samuch lemincha. So both before the first seder and before the second seder, as mincha approaches the 9th hour of the day, lo yochal adam ad shetachashech. A person should not eat until it gets dark. This seems to be already a possibility for a source for the Rambam. We have to define, of course, what shetachashech means. Does it mean when the sun sets, when 3 stars come out? But the bigger question for our purpose is when the Mishnah here says lo yochal, what is the nothing that we shouldn't eat? Is it referring to matzah that we shouldn't eat? Or is it referring to not having a big meal at all so that we come to the Seder hungry on Pesach? So the Gemara on this Mishnah says that this is referring to the Rambam's second halacha, meaning that this is referring to having a sense of chavivut for the Seder itself, about developing an appetite. But Tosfot here says that it does not have to do with the prohibition of eating matzah, because we know that from elsewhere. Okay, so this is not a great option as a source for the Rambam's first halacha, but likely, or most definitely, it is the source for the Rambam's second halacha. So let's move on to other possibilities for the Rambam's first halacha of the prohibition to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. So a strong possibility is posited by the Ba'alei Halachot Gedalot, the Bahag, which is a collection of halachot going back to Gaonic times, which the Rambam often quotes and uses as a basis for many of his halachot. And the Bahag says that there is a pasuk which could serve as the basis for this halacha of the Isser to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. The Bahag quotes this pasuk from Shmot Yudbet, pasuk Yudchet, Barishon. This is source Gimel here. Barishon ba'arba asar yom lachodesh. So on the first day of Pesach, which is on the 14th day of the month, ba'erev tochlu matzot. In the evening, you should eat unleavened bread. From here, we could say ba'erev velo bayom. That this is specifically supposed to be eaten at night to the exclusion of day, right? We might call this a lav michlal aseh, that we deduce or derive a prohibition from a something which is specifically a positive command. The fact that you should do it at night implies that you should not do it during the day. So the Bahag derives it from here that it's prohibited to eat matzah on Erev Pesach, that in advance of the Seder, we should not be eating matzah. So that, I think, is a strong candidate for where the Rambam might have derived this halacha, which is still a din d'Rabbanan, but as a derivation of this pasuk. So that's option number 2. Option number 3, for where the Rambam derives his source, is from the Maggid Mishnah, who was Rav Vidal of Tolsa, 14th century Spain, who offers a commentary on the Rambam, and he points us to a Yerushalmi. Asru Chachamim, this is in source Daled, B'Hilchot Perek Elu Ovrin in the Yerushalmi, Amar Rabbi Levi Ha'ochel Matzah Be'erev Pesach Keba'al Arusato. So let's go to that Yerushalmi to read the full sugya, understand what the Maggid Mishnah is pointing us to as a source for the Rambam. The Rambam, of course, never quotes his sources, so it's always a game, or a game is probably the wrong word, but it's always a challenge. It's always sort of an intriguing kind of quest to try and connect the dots for the Rambam in terms of where he got all of his halachot. So this Gemara in the Yerushalmi is not a PG Gemara. So just heads up that it's quite explicit. And here goes. Rav Yudan Nisi'ah. So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yudan, who was Nisi'ah, Sacha, he would go swimming. This is referring to what he was doing. The context of this is on Erev Pesach. So he would swim and Vitzacha, and he became thirsty. So why was he swimming on Erev Pesach? Perhaps he was going to the mikvah, doing a little business and pleasure at the same time, but he got a good workout out of his swim, and he was thirsty. Sha'al l'Rav Mana, and he asked his teacher, begin da'atatzachi, if thirst comes, mahu nishte, what should I drink? Meaning Pesach is almost here, and I know I'm not supposed to eat so much, but I'm really thirsty. How should I quench my thirst? So Amar Le, the teacher responds to the student, Tani Rabbi Chia says, Asr la'adam lit'om klum ad shetachashech. He says you can't even taste anything until it gets dark. So this is a similar formulation to what we saw in the Bavli, in the Mishnah, which says that you shouldn't eat anything until it gets dark, but it's a pretty extreme formulation because it's saying you can't even taste anything, almost like it's supposed to be a fast. Whereas the Bavli, when it talks about it, it says you can at least eat mine targima, things like fruit and vegetables, but nothing that is filling. Okay. Amar Rabbi Levi, continuing along in this source, ha'ochel matzah be'erev Pesach, someone who eats matzah on Erev Pesach is analogous or similar to kiba'al arusato, like someone who had relations, who had intercourse with his betrothed, with his arusato, bebeit chamav, in his father-in-law's home. V'haba al arusato bebeit chamav lokeh. And someone who does such a thing, who has relations with his fiance in his father-in-law's home, receives lashes. So what is behind this bizarre, graphic, and somewhat crude comparison? What does refraining from matzah on Erev Pesach have to do with refraining from having relations with your fiance until you finish the kiddushin process, until there is a chuppah, until the nisuin is complete? We know that after Erusin, the engagement status shifts a woman from being single to being engaged, but there is still, we say va'asur lanu et ha'arusot, under the chuppah, one of the bracha, there's still a prohibition to be together with an arusa, with your betrothed, until the halachic marriage is completed. So what is the nature of this comparison, having relations with one's fiance? Rabbi Howard Jachter, who has come to our community several times, he's one of our consultants when it comes to the Erev, suggested that perhaps this is coherent with the theme of Pesach being like a marriage of the Jewish people and Hashem. And we read a Shir Hashirim, or some have the custom after the Haggadah is over to read Shir Hashirim on the night of the Seder, because it's considered as if we are betrothing ourselves to Hashem as we come out of Egypt, but we haven't yet been under the chuppah of Har Sinai, so the process of the marriage is incomplete. So there is sort of a romantic flavor that exists on the night of Pesach, and perhaps this comparison underscores that point. Another suggestion is made by the Kolbo in the next source. The Kolbo is a 14th century code, a collection of halachot and of minhagim. Its author is unknown. There are several sort of lead candidates, but we don't know who who authored it. But it's certainly a reputable source, as many Rishonim quote from the Kolbo. So the Kolbo here in source Vav says Ha'ochel Loke Kabo Rusato Beit Chamav, right? Just quoting from the source we saw above in the Rishalmi. Perush, explanation. She'eno moshel berucho ma'at, kmo haboa rusato beit chamav, she'tia muteret lo la'alter ve'eno moshel berucho ad et ha-heter. So what the Kolbo is saying is that a person did not control their desire for something that was going to be permissible very soon. But he was impatient, he was impulsive. He acted in a way that displayed a sort of impulsiveness without having the proper patience to wait until his betrothed became permitted to him. And similarly, when it comes to matzah, if you eat matzah on Erev Pesach, it's about to become mutar. You're able to eat it in just a few hours' time. Once 3 stars emerge and it is shitachashech, it's nighttime, you make kiddush, and then you can and you say magid, you say the bracha at the end of magid, then you can get to motzi matzah. But to do it earlier is seen as something which is jumping the gun, and it ruins the uniqueness of it. The anticipation and the buildup are really part of a mitzvah. That is the idea of longing. The chavivut for the mitzvah of matzah is akin to the anticipation of being with one's intended for the first time. And I should just note that Chazal often make comparisons between sexuality and food. There is certainly sort of a sensual experience that's connected to food, as we know through the laws of Hilchot Nida, that when a couple is in that time of the month, they're not supposed to share food, because sharing food sort of leads towards other things. There's a certain intimacy that is present in food and in sharing food. So that's sort of a second rationale behind this analogy, this comparison in the Yerushalmi. The Kolbo provides a third one, which is sort of technical and somewhat arbitrary, but I think it's cute, so we'll read it and play it out. He says, "V'yesh notnim ta'am." I'm reading here from the bottom half of source Vav. "V'yesh notnim ta'am lama himshilu leboa larusato." So some give a different reason for why the prohibition of eating matzah is comparable to the prohibition of having relations with one's intended, and eating matzah is at the wrong time is like being with one intended too early. Why? Lefi kishem mispar habrachot asher ya'asu la'arusa kodem shehutra lo kacha mispar brachot seder haPesach kodem sheyochal matzah. So he says that the same number of brachot that one makes under the chuppah is the same number of brachot that one makes leading up to eating matzah. So quickly, if we just go through the math, when it comes to a bride and a groom, we know that there is the Sheva brachot. So what is the parallel, or what are the 7 with regard to the lead up to matzah? So we have the Kiddush Hayom, we have Hagafen, Shechianu, Karpas, Asher Ga'alanu at the end of the Seder, at the end of Magid, that is. Right, we have another for Ashkenazim, we have another Hagafen, then we have Netilat Yadayim, Hamotzi, and Motzi Matzah. So that's 9. So we have more than 7 of the Sheva brachot. So perhaps you could say that the 2 brachot that we make at the beginning of the chuppah of She'aser Lanu et Harusot and Hagafen would get you up to 9. So it's possible to do some math there and to sort of have, as I said, a little bit of a cute connection between the bracha preparation leading up to matzah and the bracha preparation leading up to a man and a woman being fully married and able to have relations with one another in a permitted fashion. Okay, so until now we have covered the first question, which we posed about the source of the Rambam for this halacha of not eating matzah on Erev Pesach, and we gave 3 options. We said that the Mishnah is probably not talking specifically about the Mishnah in Pesachim is probably not talking specifically about matzah, but talking more generally about the second halacha that the Rambam describes about the chavivut of building up an appetite for the Seder. But it's clear that the Yerushalmi here is very specific and narrowly focused on the mitzvah of matzah and the isur of matzah on Erev Pesach. Let me just check the chat here. I see there's some Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Miriam shared that it omits the bracha on the Neirot. So, indeed. Um, okay. So, um, moving to the second topic, or the second aspect of the timing of this Isur. So I think I mentioned already the three options. The Ramban takes the position in the Melchamot Hashem in Masechet Pesachim that it is all of the 14th, meaning from the night before. So in this case, the Isur of matzah would start from Friday night. Okay, so it would be relevant not just to the cuisine and the menu that we have on Shabbat day, but also to what we're going to serve for the Seudat Shabbat on Friday night. The other extreme is the Baal HaMaor, who says that this Isur on matzah parallels the Isur on Chametz. And we know that on Erev Pesach, the Isur on Chametz begins from Chatzot and on, the time when the Korban Pesach was about to be brought. And we go back even an hour before then, but at least from Chatzot and on a Doraita level. And so the same time that Chametz becomes Asur, according to the Baal HaMaor, Matzah also becomes Asur. And then the middle view in between is the Rambam, who says that it is referring to the morning of Erev Pesach, meaning from Shabbat morning this year. And indeed, the Mishnah Berurah paskins like the Rambam, that for those who don't have the minhag to refrain from eating matzah all the way from Nisan or all the way from Purim, one should at least refrain from eating matzah from in a formal, sense from Shabbat morning. So, according to that view, one could theoretically eat matzah for Lechem Mishnah on Friday night this year, but not on Shabbat morning. Okay, so that's a little bit about the timing of this Isur, but the critical question that we still have to answer is the scope of this Isur Achilat Matzah. What exactly is included and what is not included? What can we eat and what can we not eat? So for that, we are going to look at the poskim. We'll look first at the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and then we'll conclude with Rav Eliezer Melamed in the Pninei Halacha and the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, to talk about what the bottom line halacha is for this upcoming Friday night and or at least Shabbat days menu. Okay, so beginning with the Orach Chaim here in source number 7, the Mechaber writes in Halacha Aleph, Asur le'echol pat misha'a asirit ulamala, kidei sheyochal matzah le'teavon, aval ochel ma'at perot o yirakot, aval lo yimalei kreso mehem. So here the Mechaber is not talking about the Isur Matzah. Indeed, the Mechaber doesn't even mention any prohibition on eating matzah. What he is referring to here is what the Mishnah in Pesachim said, is that one should not eat a big meal, a bread meal on Erev Pesach, so as to ensure that one comes hungry with a healthy appetite to the Seder. Just as a side note, in terms of how one would fulfill the obligation to have Lechem Mishnah on Erev Shabbat, the suggestion that I made is to use egg matzah, because the Mechaber continues here to say, "V'kodem sha'a asirit mutar l'achol matzah ashira," that before the 10th hour one can eat enriched matzah that has eggs or oil or fruit juice in it, something that is not lechem oni, the simple bread and water that comprises the matzah that we use for the mitzvah of matzah at the Seder and beyond, right? And so one would be able to use matzah ashira for lechem mishnah on Erev Pesach, because it is not going to interfere with the isur of achilat matzah, because matzah ashira cannot be used to fulfill the obligation of matzah at the Seder. So the Mechaber here thus far has not mentioned that specific prohibition on eating matzah on Erev Pesach. He has just spoken about not eating lots of filling foods so as to come hungry. But the Rama does quote this specific isur. He says, "Aval matzot shiyotzin ba balayla asurin le'echol kol yom arba asar." And so the Rama here says that the matzot that would qualify for one's obligation of eating matzah at night is going to be prohibited to eat all of the 14th day, right? So here he's going like the Ramban, the entire 14th day, which means even beginning from the night before. One could actually interpret that it's kol yom, and to say that it's not, that just begins in the day part from dawn. And that's how the Mishnah Berurah rules. But the key takeaway for us here is that the Rama is indeed paskening like the Rambam, that one cannot eat matzah on Erev Pesach. And what kind of matzah can one not eat? The kind of matzah that one would be able to fulfill their obligation at the Seder with, and that excludes matzah ashira. So one would be able to eat matzah ashira on Erev Pesach, which is why I shared from Rav Moshe Feinstein that it's a good idea to use matzah ashira if you don't want to have chametz in your home, if you have kids, or for whatever other reason you're scared of having crumbs. So you could use egg matzah this year for your lechem mishnah for the Su'udot Shabbat. But you'd have to still finish your Su'udot Shabbat by 10 hours into the day, which is 10:46 this year, because eating something that is hamotzi shouldn't be done after a certain time, because then one ruins their appetite going into the Seder. Okay, continuing along in the Mechaber here, he says, "V'katan she'eno yodea mashe misaprim b'layla mitziat Mitzrayim mutar lahachilo." This is important for all young parents out there, which is that you are allowed to give your kids matzah on Erev Pesach if they don't know what's going on once you get to the Magid section of the Seder. Right, so hopefully we're good enough educators as parents to get all of our kids involved on some level. But a child that's younger than 4 or 5 years old, who doesn't really have the comprehension of what it means to retell the story of leaving Egypt, they are not going to be included in this prohibition, and you can give them matzah on Erev Pesach. Okay. And the Rama continues here and says that this halacha of not eating matzah on Erev Pesach also pertains to the first day of Pesach going into the second Seder. V'chein b'yom rishon shel Pesach kedei la'achol b'leil sheni l'tevon v'chein noagin k'tzat l'ma'at b'achilat matzah b'yom rishon mahai taima. So it's not as formal as the first, as going into the first Seder, but on Sunday, on Shabbos afternoon, going into the on Sunday afternoon, going into the second Seder, one should also refrain from eating matzah in the afternoon. And finally, the Rama says here, matzah shene'efa. So here this is talking about matzah that was baked, kitakna, like it should be, and then it was broken up into small pieces, and it was kneaded, right? So here we're talking about the kind of food or cuisine that Esther was mentioning earlier, right? Using matzah meal and other kinds of using oil and wine to make some sort of dish. Eina nikret matzah ashira. It's not considered to be matzah ashira, and therefore asura la'achol be'erev Pesach. So here the Rama is saying that when you use matzah meal for something on Erev Pesach, it's not considered matzah ashira unless it has fruit juice and sugars and other things, and therefore va'asura la'achol be'erev Pesach. Whereas matzah ashira was allowed to eat on Erev Pesach because you can't fulfill your obligation through it, matzah meal, which is derived from regular kosher matzah that one could eat for the Seder, just because it's broken up doesn't mean that it loses its shem matzah. It still can be reconstituted back to the place of matzah to fulfill your obligation on the eve of the Seder. And so we have to understand exactly what it is that the Rama is saying here is included in terms of using matzah meal on Erev Pesach. He seems to say so far that it's a pretty broad prohibition. It does fall under the isur of matzah on Erev Pesach, unless it's matzah ashira, anything short of matzah ashira. Matzah ashira clearly does have some fruit juice, and he does say yayin here, but it would be a difference of amounts, right? If something just has a little bit of wine and oil in it, it's still considered to be sufficiently like matzah. Whereas if it's drowned in it, then perhaps that's the difference between matzah ashira and non-matzah ashira. So let's see how the Mishnah Brura draws the line for derivatives of matzah and matzah meal, specifically in terms of what can be used on Erev Pesach. So the Mishnah Brura here, the Chafetz Chaim, on these words says, Eino nikret. He says that why is matzah meal that is kneaded with wine and oil not considered to be matzah ashira? Delo nitbatla mimena shem matzah al yedei zeh. Because this is, it's not considered to have lost its status, its of matzah through that process. Okay, so but what does that not include? The kol zeh bekishelo bishla. That's talking about when you didn't subsequently boil it. Aval im bishla, but if you took matzah meal and you combined it with other liquids or other spices or sugar, ukamo shenohagin b'medinatenu la'asot kidurim mimatzah shekorin knedlach. Right, so the Mishnah Brura is describing what we all know as matzah balls, as knedlach. So, like he says, like we do in our communities where we make knedlach, o matzah mevushelet b'kli rishon, or we boil the matzah meal in a pot. Mutar la'achola kodem sha'a sirit. You can eat it on Erev Pesach. Dezeh vadai lo mikri matzah, because that has lost its shem matzah. It doesn't have the appearance of matzah. It doesn't have the taste of matzah. And so cooking something using matzah meal on Erev Pesach is certainly going to be permissible, but it should be done before the 10th hour, because after that point, one shouldn't have anything which is a mezonot, because that is too filling, and that would violate the requirement to have an appetite going into the Seder. Okay, we have cleared matzah balls for use on Friday night and even on Shabbat morning before the 11th hour. And it happens to be that in my wife's family, they don't have matzah balls from Purim onwards. That's their adaptation of this halacha. It's sort of a minhag because clearly it's not necessary, but it is a reminder. It allows them to have a certain chavivut towards matzah balls on Seder night. So that's our custom as well. It's not rooted in halacha, but it has a sort of parallel to matzah as we see in these sources. But on a technical level, you can certainly eat matzah balls throughout Nisan and even on Erev Pesach until the 11th hour. Okay, so let's now talk about Shnietzel. Okay, so so we'll talk about Shnietzel, and we'll talk about a question that I got was about Shabbat, was about Pesach cookies, okay, that have matzah meal in them. So the Pnei Halacha, Rav Eliezer Melamed, quotes two different views on this. The first is more lenient, and the second is more stringent. So we'll read this together. He says in source Yud here, Isur achilat matzah be'erev Pesach, the prohibition on eating matzah on Erev Pesach, chal gam al shivrei matzah ktanim sheniloshim biyain o shemen. So it also applies to small pieces of matzah that are kneaded with wine or with oil. Va'af im ya'afu et ha'ta'arovet hazu. Even if you bake this ta'arovet, it's still a problem. Kol zman shetzurat hamatzah nish'eret al hashvarim. So anytime that the pieces are big enough that they are recognizable as matzah, it's going to be a problem. So matzah brai is out on Erev Pesach. All right, harei shebirkatam hamotzi, because if it's still recognizable, then you're going to be making a hamotzi on it, and therefore it's going to be usher under the umbrella of eating matzah, of the assur of eating matzah on Erev Pesach. Aval im hashvarim, even if the pieces shenilusho v'nafu ivdu et surat hamatzah shalahem, but if they are ground to very small pieces and you cannot detect by looking at it that it is matzah, right? And that's almost often the case when it comes to matzah meal. Then birkatam mizonot umutar la'ochlam be'erev Pesach. So the Eliezer Melamed would say that something like a Pesach cookie, even though it is baked, because you cannot recognize it as coming from matzah, would be fine on Erev Pesach. It would not be in violation of the Isur to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. So you can have your Pesach cookies. The Yesh Machmirim Bazeh, but he also quotes a stringent opinion. Even if you do grind the matzah to make it like matzah meal, and you put oil and sweetener in it, and you make cookies or a Pesach cake with it, and even though it doesn't have the shape of matzah anymore, asur la'ochlam, you are still forbidden from eating them. Why? Mishum sha'adayin birkat hamotzi shayechet lahem, because even on a Pesach cake and a Pesach cookie, the bracha of hamotzi is still connected to them. How so? She'im yochlu mehem kishiur kvi'at suda yivarchu alem hamotzi. When you have one cookie, you make a mazono. When you have one slice of cake, you make a mazono if it has matzah meal in it. But if you were to have an entire meal of cookies, and that would be the mainstay of your meal, then it's considered to be pat haba b'kisnin, and in the right context and the right volume, you would make a hamotzi on it. So nimtza she'adayin lo fag mehem she matzah, and therefore this is Rav Kook that he is quoting here. Rav Kook argues that because there is some connection to hamotzi that still stands with the pat haba b'kisnin, it hasn't completely left the category of matzah. And therefore, Isur achilat matzah be'erev Pesach chal gam al ma'afim ha'mevosasim al kemach matzah. And therefore, Rav Kook and the Vilna Gaon argue that even a Pesach cookie or a Pesach cake would fall under the prohibition of eating matzah on Erev Pesach. And so here we have a stringent view that's contrasted with the Mishnah Berurah, which is a more permissive view. And my teacher, Rav Mordechai Willig, paskins like the Mishnah Berurah here, and it allows for Pesach cookies on Erev Pesach. But I know that there are different opinions on this, and some adopt the more stringent view. Now, as this relates to Shnietzel, because I know you've been waiting to hear the verdict on Shnietzel, it would seem, based on everything that we have studied until now, that we could make a distinction between baking and frying Shnietzel. Because if one bakes the Shnietzel, then they might still have the shame and the toar and the ta'am of matzah on them. The cover or the coating of matzah meal on Shnietzel that's baked is more intact than the matzah that is fried, in which it already becomes a little bit more denser in its consistency and maybe more part of the chicken itself. And so indeed, the Shar HaTzion, which is the Mishnah Berurah's notes on the Mishnah Berurah, he notes that there are some people who say that if Shnietzel is baked, then it's a problem on Erev Pesach using matzah meal. And this is according to the Machmir view, because of course the Mishnah Berurah himself, who says that if anything is really a mizono, like the coating of Shnietzel would be, because the pieces of matzah meal are not recognizable and therefore they would never be hamotzi. So he would say, of course, even if you bake Shnietzel, it would be fine. But even according to the Machmirim, even according to Rav Kook here, you could argue that if it's fried Shnietzel, just like something which is boiled, like matzah balls, it would never have the possibility of being hamotzi. And because it's lost the form, the shape, the taste of matzah, and it's not in the category of hamotzi anymore, it would certainly be permissible on Erev Shabbat. So I would certainly allow for eating matzah meal coated Shnietzel that is baked. But if you are more machmir, then you can fry them, and I think they're usually tastier that way, anyways. So that would be my recommendation for this Erev Pesach. Okay, so that rounds out the source material that I wanted to cover this evening. To get to that hopefully very practical landing about our menu for Erev Pesach this year. So matzah balls certainly is a check, and Shnietzel is certainly a check. So we came out, I think, in a place that hopefully most people can be satisfied and feel like they have options for Erev Pesach, which is a good thing given our limited menu as is. So I hope that this provides a little bit of a rationale for our unique setup this year in terms of trying to both have a excitement for the Seder with not eating large amounts of food on Erev Pesach, but still maintaining a proper kavod for Shabbat by having a delicious food. I am available and eager if anyone has any questions or clarifications. I'll stop the recording and